Welcome back. This is the second video in the series, My Addiction Has to Go. And what we're going to deal with here is trying to get an understanding of your how. How did I get here? Now, in the first video, we talked about your why. Why would I get off this destructive path? And why would I get on this healthy path? Why would I basically kick my addiction out of my life? And so I hope that you spent some time really exploring your why. And we talked about several things that are good reasons, but ultimately they fail time and time again. Men tell me the same thing. You know, I don't want to hurt my wife's feelings. I don't want to be embarrassed. I don't want to get caught. And then they don't produce the results. So we have to create a life that we look forward to the extent where we're no longer even interested in an addiction that has created so much havoc in our life. So I hope you spent some time doing that in that first video. And if you go through all the videos together, then I encourage you to go back and take seriously those things I ask you to do. This is kind of how I work through these things with the men in my office. And so what we want to do now is try to understand how did I get here? How has my porn habit survived all this time? Now, I really want you to ask yourself that question and think about it. Take a lot of time to think about it. I'm going to give you maybe a handful of reasons that men have shared with me. Some of them are pretty serious, and we'll talk through each of them. But you may have something completely different. I want you to ask that question, though. How did porn make its way into my life, and how has it survived all this time? I actually watched a video on this the other day on this fellow who's trying to be helpful, and he basically reduced a man's porn habit to really just having an urge and a desire and seeking a release. And as much as there's some physiological truth to that, it certainly does not tell the whole story. And I would not encourage you to believe that that's it, that it's just some physiological drive and need that a man has, and that's how he chooses to exercise it. I think it is much deeper than that, and what I'm about to share with you is going to, I think, reveal that. So let me just walk through a handful of things that I've been told. The first one is perhaps the most obvious. I don't assume this when a man comes into my office, but many men have been sexually abused early in their life, whether they were just old enough to remember, or maybe when they got into their formative years, there was some experimentation with somebody that was older and that turned into an abusive scenario. It's heartbreaking for me when a man comes in and tells me that he's endured some sexual abuse and he's never told anybody, or he's not shared it with his wife or his girlfriend. I can tell you there have been a few times when I was the first person on the planet that heard their story. And it's important. It's vitally important for you to be able to share some of those reasons, some of those early reasons, especially if it involves abuse. Now, with that being said, there may be a situation where you need extended and more intense therapy for the trauma that you may have incurred, depending on what it was and how long it lasted. So I would encourage you to seek professional help if you feel like there was some pretty serious abuse going on that maybe you've never shared, or you recognize that there's some things there you have not ever processed and some grief that you need to endure. So abuse, that's certainly one reason how a porn habit can form and even survive, especially if you've never dealt with it. The second one is early access. Curiosity certainly starts to take place, I think, for kids in adolescent years, pre-adolescence, right before puberty, or right at that line where you begin to wonder about the differences between boys and girls. But I'm talking about even something else. Like I had a previous client whose early access consists of, it's actually a picture. And it's a picture of him in the house as a 5-year-old boy in the bathroom pouring through a pornographic magazine that was just sitting on the back of the toilet. And that picture was, in fact, kind of a family punchline, because it was an okay thing for kids in their household, for young boys to be able to have access to pornography. So no abuse there. But I can tell you that having early access plants premature seeds in the mind of a male that are not supposed to be planted yet, and certainly are not supposed to grow. So that may be something that you have as a part of your story. Lack of supervision is another one. I have a client who he came to me with a frame of abuse that when you unpack it, it really, it just amounts to the fact that there was such poor parental supervision in their home that it was almost like a coin flip every day that something like this didn't happen. You know, when you put kids in an environment without parental supervision, it's just a matter of time before they begin to go down paths and explore things that they're not supposed to explore. So what was originally framed as a traumatic thing, which it was, but it helps a little bit to understand that you were a little kid and the person that did this was a little kid. And if there had been better supervision, then there was no deviance necessarily. There was just such a lack of parental supervision that this was almost inevitable. So I mentioned that as certainly a possibility as well. Another one that I would have to say is not as common that men would share with me. I call it cultural norming. Our culture has reduced pornography to something of a norm. It's laughed at in sitcoms. It's glossed over in movies. It's almost stated as commonplace as going to the refrigerator, getting a glass of milk when you're hungry in the middle of the night with a couple of cookies. I mean, it's framed in such a destructive way. And if you've done any research on what pornography does to the male brain, then you can tell that it's certainly been revealed that it is extremely destructive. The dopamine and the chemical releases in your brain that it exhausts those chemicals to the extent where your body can't produce them at the level that it needs, and it is not healthy by any means. It's not normal, it's not healthy, it's not good, and yet our culture tends to portray that it is. I think the final one I want to share with you is what I call evolution. How did my porn habit survive? Well, maybe it evolved. Maybe it started off as a curiosity, and then it turned into a normal thing, and then it became more of an entitlement, and that entitlement became a habit, and then the habit became a protected habit. In spite of the fact that there were consequences that began to fall out of the closet on you, you began to believe that this was such a part of your life that you couldn't let it go. And so it evolved to the place where it's not just pornography, now it's live interaction, and then it became meetups, and it just keeps growing and growing. And it gets back to that brain chemistry, how if you, like any addiction, if you don't get that next high, then you have to produce a new level of excitement in order to achieve that. So I would encourage you to take some time to look at how was this entered, how did it enter into your life, and then how did it evolve? Because, well, I'll tell you this more in a minute, but if it can evolve, it can devolve. Okay? How? All right. So there was this famous experiment in the 1970s by a psychologist by the name of Bruce Alexander, and they call it Rat Park. You may have heard about it. There's been some controversy as far as what the real takeaways were or what even the evaluation was about the conclusion. But basically they had two groups of rats, two control groups. The first control group was one rat in a very small environment with access to morphine and water. And it was pretty apparent that in that environment that the rat was going to access the morphine, which of course is a pain reliever, and it allowed him to get some kind of a high, and he accessed that quite readily. So they tried something else. Well, let's have another control group with a bunch of rats. This is a group of rats, 15 to 20. And it's a large, like I don't know, 100 times bigger than the original. And they call it Rat Park, and there's places to play, and there's toys, and there's places to hang out, and there's rooms for mating and food and recreation and activities and water and morphine. Well, in Rat Park, the amount of, the number of times that the rats would access the morphine was so insignificant that it was statistically significant. When you put one rat in one enclosure with only two choices and one of them is destructive, and then you put a bunch of rats where they have access to food and play and social activity and other things to do, there's just such a difference in the way those rats, of course, would react. Well, what's the main conclusion? I think it's safe to say that as a result of Dr. Bruce's study that environment matters. And so I would ask you to take a serious look at your environment. And if you're in my office working with me, that's one of the things I would ask you to do. I want you to describe your environment to me. Talk about what you do during the day. Who do you interact with? What about your job? Who are your friends? What kind of self-care plan do you have? And we talk about these things because if your addiction can evolve, then it can also devolve. In other words, what I encourage guys to do is to build your own version of Rat Park. Build a life that is exciting and interesting and that you look forward to. I referenced this gentleman earlier, this gentleman that just got a promotion in his job, that we're hardly even talking about his addiction anymore. And he's almost like, I can't believe we're not even talking about that. Like he thought that's all we were going to talk about was his addiction. And when he took his job seriously and he went to his boss and he asked for where he could help out more, his boss took him seriously and then he gave him more responsibility. And now he's ascending through this ladder of success in his industry, enjoying his work, being given more opportunities. I mean, this is exciting stuff. When you look at your friends and you ask yourself, well, no, I don't have any friends. Well, I mean, go to meetup.com and find out the different groups. There's hiking groups, there's camping groups, there's fishing groups, there's like groups for all kinds of stuff. And formulate a group of people in your life that are doing things that, by the way, have nothing to do with having access to pornography. Well, we'll talk about that more later, but take a look at your self-care routine. Are you taking care of yourself? Are you doing some things that give you individual joy? Again, that have nothing to do or put you in an environment where your addiction could be an issue again. If your addiction can evolve, then it can also devolve. So one of the things that I love to do in a men's group, I have a couple men's groups that I work with. They're not necessarily about addictions. But I asked them to do a vision board. You may have done a vision board before. This one's a little different. It's not just a vision of the kind of car that I want to drive and the kind of house that I want to live in and the kind of thing that I want to see myself doing. I asked them to divide it up into three areas. And our vision board looks like this. It's number one is, who would you like to be? What character qualities would you like to be true? You know, when you're at the end of your life and there's people around your casket and they're talking about you, what character qualities would you like them to say about you? Who would you like to be? Another thing I asked him to write out is, what would I like to do? Not just for a living, but for fun. What kind of things would I love to do? What hobbies maybe are you interested in? You know, it's actually a productive thing to do. I tell my guys this too. Go to Google, type in top 100 hobbies and see what comes up. You'd be amazed at the cool stuff that people are out there doing that you may be interested in. I did this once and took up canning. Don't laugh, but I did. I started canning in the kitchen like Betty Crocker with an apron and everything. And I really enjoyed it. It was kind of an exciting thing for me to create like fruit and preserves for my family and to be able to put away in the pantry for another time. So what would I like to do? And the last one is, where would I like to go? Where would I like to go? You have a bucket list of places you want to visit? They don't have to be expensive. They don't have to be far away. Maybe it's someplace within 100 miles where you live now. You just haven't taken the time to actually envision it and then go do it. All right. Let me give you a last couple things here and then we'll wrap this video up. I want to encourage you to write out your story. I mean, how did you get here? You may not have shared the whole thing with anybody. Or when you tried, it wasn't received well. Or whoever listened thought you were making excuses. This is an important part of your growth here, is to write out your story. Where did it begin? How did it evolve? How did you get here? Secondly, go ahead and take the time to create a vision board and answer the question, where do I want to go? Where do you want to go? Understand your how. This is the development of the mindset that allows you to say, it's time for my addiction to go. I'll see you in the next video.